Welcome to Our Nation Today. I'm K.R. Davidson. Thanks for joining us as we look at the stories behind the headlines. Canada and the U.S. are discussing trade issues in the first Free Trade Commission meeting of the U.S.-MCA agreement. The trilateral meeting includes Canada, the U.S., and Mexico. Before the Trade Commission meeting, International Trade Minister Mary Ng met virtually with U.S. Trade Representative Catherine Tai to discuss outstanding issues, which include the ongoing softwood lumber dispute, Pipeline 5, Canada's new digital tax, and the U.S.'s access to Canada's dairy market. We're going to be chatting more about this with Nathaniel, our senior analyst at the News Forum. So let's take a look. There's a lot of topics. We've been talking about Pipeline 5 as of late. We were talking about softwood lumber, or just touching upon those high lumber prices yesterday. Give us a little bit of background, what was happening in these talks that preceded the trade talks.
So basically, U.S. and Canada just came together, tried to align sort of the major issues. So for Canada, that was for us, of course, the Buy America provisions, a bit of protectionism.
Buy America or Buy American?
Right.
Okay, I know
that is
two.
an important distinction there, right? But general protectionist measures, right?
Yeah.
As well as energy security in the Line 5.
Pipeline 5?
Pipeline 5, yeah. And then we have as well the softwood lumber, which is, of course, a perennial dispute between Canada and the U.S. when it comes to trade.
Going back to the 1980s now, right?
Right. And so not much change on that front. And from the U.S. side, their main concerns are around, of course, dairy and the new 3% Netflix tax, if you will.
Sure. And so when we're taking a look at the dairy provisions, it looks like there was some negotiation to be able to allow the U.S. to have greater access into Canada's well-structured dairy market. Mm-hmm. We'll go into its supply management system in a bit. But let's just take a look at the softwood lumber, because I think that there's agreement now in the States, or there seems to be a clash between certain political factions or interest groups.
Well, I would say far more interest groups. I mean, you got the Lumber Association that supports the high tariffs because...
Sure.
I mean,
which are there in the first place, probably.
And I should take a step back and say, the U.S. does not produce enough softwood lumber to meet its demand.
Sure.
Right. So every time that they have to import in under a tariff, that actually boosts the cost of the softwood lumber that they're getting.
Significantly with Donald Trump at a 20% tariff that was just dropped to 9%.
Right.
The WTO found that they were actually in violation.
Every time this dispute goes to the WTO, Canada wins an award.
Okay, so just give a little bit of the underlying narrative on that dispute.
Sure. Well, Canada and the U.S. have very different systems of forest ownership. 90%
owns
of
most of
ours is owned by Crown land, Crown forest.
Yeah.
Whereas in the U.S., over half, close to 60%, is privately owned.
Okay.
Right. So there's some distinctions there. They sell their lumber on a lottery basis. We sell ours on a stumpage rate that is set by the government.
And they're saying our rates are too low.
They say our rates are too low. Canada says this is our constitutional framework. We can't just change that on a whim.
So let's hit into the dairy issue.
Right.
So they're also saying that there's a problem here in Canada with our supply management system. We control quotas. They can't come into the market. So what's happening on that front?
I mean, if you talk to any dairy farmer recently, they'll say, well, they are certainly coming into our market. We've had to give up X amount. They finally got compensated for it, right? So for some farmers, a very significant dent in their quota content. But
and there was a compensation package from the federal government when they entered into this, and they said that it was a couple $1 billion payout, but they said that it's not going to deal with the long-term repercussions of that. But how do basically we have a supply chain management. How does that justify when you have free trade? Isn't that merely just a closed system?
Well, in some ways, I think. I mean, the discussion on supply management in Canada is definitely a worthy conversation that could last quite a while.
I mean, you can't cover it off in 30 seconds.
No, exactly. So. But what I think is important to note is that due to different concerns around American product, Canada has put in some health restrictions, and we have ourselves a robust network of family-owned dairy farms.
Put emphasis on the robust because you're the great advocate.
Right.
Take a look at any quotas.
I would also like to point out, though, that a lot is mentioned about Canadian cost of milk and whatnot. But this is not, the taxpayer doesn't cover that. In the U.S., there's billions of dollars that are spent every year on subsidies for...
And that is the final word from Nathaniel. So the trade relationship between Canada and the U.S. spans across all sectors, and this mutual trade is important to both of our countries. While the softwood lumber dispute and concerns regarding agricultural protectionist policies have been ongoing for decades, the Pipeline 5 dispute is hopefully an isolated event. Canada has always had to navigate a fine line between friendliness that we hold with our great powers and the necessity to ensure that our national interests do not bow under the pressure of these relationships. Canada's solution to this issue has always been to give strong and able leadership And we will wait to see how the current government fares in this regard. Stay with us as we bring you up to speed with what's happening with Bill C-10. Welcome back to Our Nation Today. The battle over Bill C-10 continues. While some experts have expressed their support for the proposed legislation, one of the bill's fiercest critics says it's too flawed to be salvaged. The Canada Research Chair in Internet and E-commerce Law, Michael Geist, says the bill would encroach on personal freedoms, including the freedom of expression. However, the government is continuing to assert that the bill is fine, and the Justice Department recently issued a new analysis that says the Bill C-10 is charter compliant. On the other hand, Professor Geist says that no other country in the world uses broadcast regulation to regulate user-generated content in this way, and it could be a risk to net neutrality along with freedom of expression. So Michael Geist is coming out really strong on this, and it's really interesting because you've got a Canadian chair. He's got a previous Order of Canada. You wouldn't see this strong language, but he's come out strong in the past when there's been some sort of government control over, I think it was Bill C-11 on control of internet sites or such. So give us a bit of an understanding. He served as an expert before the Heritage Committee. What were some of his findings? What's he saying on this?
Well, I mean, you summarized it fairly well in your introduction there. It was simply just a matter of saying this bill has the great risk of running over free expression rights and the principle of net neutrality in Canada. Opposition to that or support to the bill was saying, look, this is not going to get in the way of anything to do with individual users. This is just moderating the big giants online, right?
So that was what it looked like before it went into committee. They removed 4.1. 4.1 then says that now any of the user content now falls under this programming umbrella, and so now the CRTC can regulate.
And that's where Michael Geist said, "Look, there's no other country in the world that uses their broadcast regulator to regulate or monitor or control, depending on what you want to say,
social content
the internet." Right? Yeah, users uploading things on the
and there
online.
seems to be this defense saying that they need to deal with the disclosure aspect, and I'm trying to take a look. I'm like, what are they talking about with this disclosure aspect? But it's basically be able to regulate content from the social media providers to make sure that there's enough Canadian content. But all the experts are saying, you don't have to, you can impose that on the social media companies. Why are you including users under this part? And the government's answer is,
exactly. I just thought there would be a very clear, to me, I don't understand. If users are not going to be affected, I really don't understand why we wouldn't keep that 4.1 clause in there, right? This is the whole thing. You got to make it clear that users are protected.
Absolutely.
And if you are the party of the charter, as the Liberal Party often says it is, surely it should be very easy for you to say, hey, look, guess what? Your expression rights will not be infringed upon by this legislation. Here's a clear line that says so.
I keep on trying to just get an understanding. Why do they keep on pressing on this front? Why don't they just put in 4.1? 4.1 was what they had in there in the first place. I think that it can only mean that they want to control at the user level, the content that's going in.
And this is where, at the end of the day, the Bloc Québécois have offered to work with the Liberals on this matter. This bill is popular in Quebec.
Because of the cultural content.
Exactly, cultural content, and that's important to a lot of Quebecers and a lot of Canadians in the creative industry as well. And Michael Geist said it himself, this isn't, just because you don't support this bill doesn't mean you don't support creators of content in Canada. But it just means we've got some concerns.
But even more than that, the thought that you have to. So I think one of the arguments was, well, you need to be able to regulate YouTube because if not, you can't control the content creation. But the reality is, YouTube's premium music model could be regulated outside of throwing all the users into that basket. So I think that this argument is. I think that this is overreach in a great deal.
Well, and here's the thing. The CRTC has been very clear that it's net neutrality. The principle of net neutrality is very, very important to it. It's very crucial to how it runs and how it operates. And so I think we don't want to throw CRTC. I'm not wanting to throw CRTC under the bus here. This is just unclear legislation.
Well, I think any time that you give power, that there's going to be the opportunity that could be used. And I think that this is the issue. I don't see how that this could withstand a charter challenge in the first instance.
The committee mentioned something about that.
Yeah, you've got the leading expert in Canada that's saying that this is
Internet and e-commerce law.
So Michael Geist has stated that he is shaken by the government's lack of concern for freedom of Canadians relating to their use of social media. If the government is seeking to remedy issues regarding the distribution of Canadian content, they need to take steps to draft provisions that address these issues directly. And they also need to avoid any language that is equivalent to censorship. It is unacceptable to take shortcuts in legislation that will serve to undermine the fundamental rights of Canadians. And it's time for the emperor to accept that he has no clothes on. Stay with us. When we return, we'll be looking at the ticketing protesters in Nova Scotia. Welcome back to Our Nation Today. Police in Halifax are defending their ticketing of protesters over the weekend. 2 protests took place on Saturday. One was a protest in solidarity with Palestinians, while the other was an anti-mask protest. Police say both protest groups were informed their protests were illegal. Nova Scotia Premier Ian Rankin obtained an injunction against public protest earlier. However, many protesters says their rights have been violated. So give us a little background on these protests. We've got 2 different protests that are occurring. Give us some of the factual overview of what's happening in Halifax, because I think we saw a similar thing in Alberta just before this, and there's another case that
Toronto as well, Ottawa. There was
there's the big protest.
A spate of
spate. I like that word. That's fantastic
protests,
word.
Right?
Okay,
well,
give us some background
for
here.
That. So I think what was happening, there's both an anti-masking, anti-COVID-19 restrictions protest that was going on.
That was part of this global protest that occurred? Was that the same day?
And then there was also the advocacy for Palestinian groups in that was also happening at the same time. Distinction between the two. Capitol Hill, or the
You're so used to the protest in Ottawa, aren't
that's
you?
right. Yeah. The anti-masking protesters were all gathered without much necessarily regard for social distancing rules, whereas the pro-Palestinian advocates are very clear. They were in their cars, they were socially distanced at that rate, and they were taking the appropriate precautions to limit people. And
I actually saw that both groups actually contacted the police beforehand, said that they're having these rallies and such.
And
of
at
course,
the same
you
time,
saw
the police also said these rallies are not permissible. So,
well, of course, because the Emergency Measures Act is saying that you're,
Right.
I don't even know if there's a stay-at-home order in Halifax right now. So.
I know that you were looking into a bit of the case around the injunction order, and I don't know.
Yeah, so I read. So, the interesting part is, I think everybody's been waiting for a charter challenge to come before the courts to be able to go, okay, is this legislation going to be able to stand up? But when we're taking a look at it, this is actually what's referred to as an injunction. So an injunction is just this emergency request of the court to be able to give an order. And what was interesting is when I read the case, I'm waiting for the charter analysis to come about. And yet the judge goes, because it's an injunction, we don't have to go into the charter analysis. They're referring on this case, RJR McDonald, so they didn't have to deal with the issue. And I think one of the impressions that's given when a judge gives an order on this, and of course everybody's not familiar with injunctions, is that, wow, a judge has ordered that this is against the charter. And that's not the case. The judge in the Halifax case actually referred to the Ingram case, which is the Alberta one. And so I think that the judiciary, and I think fairly, they've been wanting to avoid having to come down with any definitive positions on the charter.
It's inevitable it's going to come. Right? In some ways, yeah.
Well, and I think that there's a lot of other jurisprudence which is going to challenge, whether the restrictions are in line with scientific evidence, and that's just a whole.
But from what I was reading, there's not a lot of jurisprudence on the freedom of assembly in particular, or peaceful assembly in particular. So, yeah, it's going to be interesting to see. I'm sure that this is all going to develop a bit more of that case law.
Well, I think it might actually fall into, there's these forgotten freedoms in the charter, like freedom of conscience, and I think freedom of assembly sort of falls in there. But since COVID-19, that door's been blown wide open. This question of freedom of assembly has been not only in play with protests, church groups, and otherwise. And so you're seeing this. These nascent charter issues burgeoning. Right. And so I don't know how that's going to work more fully.
I mean, what I'm curious about is the law is the law. It should apply to everyone equally. If you have one protest group versus another, it shouldn't matter what your cause is. It should apply equally,
I'm so glad that you refer to that. So the interesting part is if you take a look at the law in Ontario, or if you take a look at the federal government's Emergency Measures Act, it says that by making these orders, that it's concerned with the safety and welfare of the people of Ontario in times of declared emergency in a matter that's subject to the Charter of Rights and Freedoms.
Right.
And the federal government says that as well. The Nova Scotia Emergency Measures Act doesn't say that, and the Alberta Emergency Measures Act doesn't say that. And so I thought maybe the judge is going to have to take a look at how does that apply in that. I think he was able to escape that issue, and I got to close you off because we got to go to our close.
I just say we should all follow public health measures. So,
And there's his last word. Since COVID-19, there has been a struggle between balancing restrictions on the fundamental freedoms we enjoy as Canadians and ensuring the protection of those around us. Canada is founded on democratic principles, and the right to assembly or to protest has been codified in these rights. Both the Nova Scotia and Alberta courts did not wade into an analysis of the provisions of the Emergency Measures Act, and the application of the Charter has not been dealt with before the courts. And we have yet to get a ruling on whether these acts can stand up to a charter challenge. I'm sure we'll be looking at this issue in the not so distant future, but stay with us. When we return, we're going to be looking at France's forgiveness of Sudan's $5 billion loan. Welcome back to Our Nation Today. The president of France has announced he is canceling Sudan's debt worth $5 billion. The move is to help Sudan's transitional government and its economic recovery. The announcement was made at a conference gathering of African leaders and creditors and marked Sudan's return into the world community after 3 decades of isolation under Omar al-Bashir. President Macron is calling on other lenders to forgive debt as well. The issue of loans and foreign aid continues to be controversial, with some saying it alleviates poverty, while others saying it is a debt trap and a form of neocolonialism. It's a very interesting topic in and of itself. It's great to see Sudan coming back into the fold here. There's a transitional government there that, there was a populist-led coup by the military, and there's a civilian board that's in play. So France is leading that. We see others that came into play, Germany, and the biggest debts being held by some of the Middle Eastern countries. So give us just a bit more of a background there, and then we get to talk about this whole concept of foreign aid, which is, in a nutshell, something to crack open.
And that's the
itself.
Interesting thing. So, Sudan's been having issues just covering the arrears of its debts. And so this is a move to help the country get back, I would say, on its feet, or get onto its feet in general. So, France is leading the charge on this. Other international creditors as well and participating. Kuwait is, interestingly, the largest holder of Sudan's debt, and so they say they're open to debt resolution discussions. So that'll be interesting to see how that works forward.
Sudan's got like a 300% inflation rate,
and that was part of the moves required to deal with their debt. So in other words, they had to make some structural adjustments to their economy, which is often required by the IMF before offering.
So let's talk about this, because with the lending of funds always comes conditions, or it seems like there's always conditions. And I think that a lot of people are taking a look, and there's been a lot of analysis over the last couple of decades going, is this actually working? Is the foreign aid working, or is this some sort of attempt to control other countries in some form or fashion?
And its entire university courses and undergraduate degrees.
Yeah, that's right.
So,
welcome to political science.
This is a fairly intense topic and deep.
Okay, but let's go into this. Let's go into this a bit. Let's go into the topic of foreign aid. Or even, why don't you give me some of your initial thoughts on that?
I think it's important to separate foreign aid from just debt being issued to countries. So countries may go to creditors and ask, hey, can you lend me some money? I need to accomplish this project. Then they are given money, and in return, they have to pay that money off through regular payments.
In fact, it actually started with infrastructure projects. We had the Marshall Plan, which actually was a very successful display of what can occur. Right. And then we had infrastructure projects, and then it's developed into.
Actually, and interesting note, the first law on foreign aid in particular came out of the UK. So the Marshall Plan was one of the first ones, right? And so, but it's interesting to know that was the first legal statute, right, in 1929.
Sure.
So, but you're right. The Marshall Plan really expanded that, especially for the building up of post-war Europe, right, where there was a lot of destruction and whatnot. However, back to aid itself, there's basically 3 different camps when it comes to foreign aid. Foreign aid doesn't help anything; it hurts the country. There's not been enough foreign aid, and the third one is basically, it hasn't been targeted the correct way. effectively for optimal.
Well, and I
optimal
think some of the
results.
more recent studies are actually saying that. The question, they actually say that there's been a 1% lift in GDP in most of the African countries, which is actually better than stagnation. But it's still, there's a lot of conditions that are coming in play.
Right, and GDP is one metric to measure economic growth, right?
Sure.
Some communities,
but China's coming in strong on this in the Belt and Road Initiative, and you're seeing some unbelievable measures lacking transparency, et cetera.
Unbelievable is the complete correct term. I mean, you have countries that are under non-disclosure agreements. They cannot reveal the terms of their loan that they're getting from China. So we don't know what the consequences are. I mean, this is all very fundamentally different from
critical parts of their natural resources.
Right,
or
for
ports
democratic
or
countries, their citizens expect to have some sort of input into where their public finance.
I'm sure we're going to chat
treasury is
more
going
on
there.
this in days to come. The second president of the United States, John Adams, stated there are two ways to conquer. One is to enslave a country by the sword, and the other is by debt. This is not a reflection of whether foreign aid is good or bad. It's a question of whether it is truly benevolent. When public lenders lend to countries to advance their own policy interests, the benevolence turns to influence and at worst, control. Private lenders should also be restrained from increasing the value of their portfolios at the expense of those most in need. Again, loans and aid are not the problem. The issue lies with what motivates the one who's extending the hand to the other. Both Nathaniel and I would like to thank you for watching Our Nation today. Remember, keep examining and know that you are part of the solution.